Just a nurse. That's what they saw when Natalie Hayes pushed through the ER doors at Mercy General at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. They didn't see the scars that ran like circuit patterns up her forearms beneath long sleeves, pale tributaries mapped across muscle that still remembered how to carry a grown man 3 miles under fire. They didn't see the hands that had held together a 7-year-old boy pulled from rubble in Marjah while rounds snapped past her helmet. They didn't see the Navy cross folded in the bottom of a storage box in a Savannah apartment, gathering dust next to discharge papers she'd signed with a name that belonged to someone else now. 20 years of silence had a weight. Natalie carried it the way she carried everything, invisible, precise, deliberate. Her first night shift stretched ahead of her like an ocean. Mercy General's ER hummed with the rhythm of crisis and recovery, a geography of suffering she'd learned to navigate without drawing attention. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the particular frequency of helicopters, and her shoulders tightened instinctively before she forced them down. Loud noises were information. Pain was data. Fear was a tool you set down when the job started. She repeated this like a mantra as a crash echoed from the supply room, stainless steel instrument tray hitting tile, the sound sharp and unforgiving as rifle fire. Orderlies cursed. Someone laughed. Natalie's hands trembled for exactly 3 seconds, then steadied as muscle memory took over. She was moving before the shaking stopped, before the adrenaline finished flooding her system, reaching a patient who needed for access more than she needed to process the sound of violence. "Got you," she said quietly to the woman in Trauma Bay 3, a 40-something diabetic in acute hyperglycemic crisis, her glucose spiking towards 600. Natalie's fingers found the radial artery with the kind of precision that only came from 100 field operations. The needle went in clean. The four-line established in 18 seconds. "That's better. You're safe." She didn't know yet if she was talking to the patient or to herself. By Thursday of that same week, Dr. Sterling had already begun to notice her. He was a man who lived by observation, the kind of doctor who saw human beings as problem sets to be sold and moneyized. His office on the hospital's 3rd floor overlooked the ER entrance, and from that vantage point he watched the new night shift nurse move through the department like a ghost, efficient, competent, and somehow completely unremarkable. Forgettable. Which was exactly how she wanted to be. But Sterling was not the type of man to let competence pass without examination. Competence was either an asset to be controlled or a threat to be neutralized. Nothing in between. On Wednesday morning, he'd caught something in his peripheral vision. The nurse, Natalie, he'd learned from the roster, hovering near his open laptop while he'd stepped into a patient consult. Not touching anything. Not logging in. Just reading. He'd watched her eyes move across a billing code summary for veteran patients under his care, charges for procedures that would stand up to audit, mostly, if anyone bothered to audit a rural Savannah hospital where administrators were overworked and the board members owed him favors going back 13 years. Inflated imaging charges. Phantom consultations. A catheterization procedure billed at triple the actual time spent. Nothing crude. Nothing obvious. Just the careful skimming of margin that kept his offshore accounts in Grand Cayman growing at a rate that justified the risk. The nurse had looked at the numbers for maybe 4 seconds. Then she'd walked away without touching the keyboard. That was the moment Sterling decided to watch her more carefully. Natalie kept her locker on the 2nd floor, a cramped space that she shared with 2 other nurses she barely spoke to. Her jacket hung on a hook, navy blue, and frayed at the cuffs, and inside the lining, stitched there with surgical precision using thread she'd found in a first aid kit, was a faded unit patch. Tan fabric worn soft as skin, embroidered unit insignia so old the colors had faded to ghosts of what they'd been, Special Forces, 2003 designation. She touched it sometimes during breaks, her fingers finding the stitching in the darkness of her locker, grounding herself to something that felt more real than the scrubs and the fluorescent lights and the careful, deliberate invisibility she'd constructed around herself like a second skin. The patch was all that remained. The medals were boxed. The photographs had been destroyed. The name on her discharge papers, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, belonged to a woman who had died in Marjah in a way that had nothing to do with bullets or explosions. That woman had carried a child through fire. That woman had held a boy's blood on her hands and promised him safety in a language she'd learned phonetically in the sand and screaming. That woman had come home to a Marine who understood what it meant to give everything you had and still be hungry for more meaning. And when he was gone, she'd needed to disappear completely. The scrubs and the invisibility and the careful, measured way she moved through hospital corridors, that was the only identity that felt honest anymore. 6 a.m. arrived the way it always did, sudden and inevitable, and the ER intake log registered a new patient, stretcher arrival from the streets of Savannah, transported by EMS to Mercy General's emergency department. The veteran had been found at dawn sitting against a boarded-up storefront on River Street, disoriented and complaining of nonspecific abdominal pain. Intake nurse Chandler had logged him as non-critical, stable vitals, possible pain management case or substance withdrawal. The paperwork indicated a psychiatric hold possibility. No insurance. Homeless. The kind of case that Mercy General's administrative staff would shrug at, treat, and release without fanfare. But Natalie Hayes recognized his face. It took her a moment, 3 seconds of eye contact as she approached the stretcher with a blood pressure cuff in her hands, and then recognition slammed into her like a physical force. The face was older now, the features sharpened by hardship and the particular exhaustion of living without sight. His eyes were scarred, clouded over with the white cataracts of someone who'd lost vision in a way that had nothing to do with age. But the bone structure was the same. The shape of his jaw. The way his hands moved, searching for something to hold onto even in the relative safety of a hospital stretcher. She knew that face. She'd seen it 20 years ago in the rubble of a collapsed compound in Marjah, a 7-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, pulling toward her through the smoke while bullets snapped past their heads. She'd carried him. She'd run 3 miles with him on her hip, his arms locked around her neck, his weight the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground while the world fell away. Natalie's hand steadied. Her voice dropped to a register so quiet that only the patient could hear it. "What's your name?" she asked, keeping her eyes on his face, searching for confirmation in the architecture of his features. The man turned his head toward her voice. His scarred eye searched the darkness in front of him, unable to find her but finding her anyway through something that transcended sight. "Khalid," he said in English marked by an accent that belonged to no single place, the accent of a translator caught between 2 countries. "My name is Khalid. I'm looking for someone." Natalie's breath caught. 20 years of silence, and the past had just walked through Mercy General's automatic doors. She moved her hand to his arm, feeling the muscle beneath the worn fabric of his jacket. Under her fingers, she found something unusual, a texture that didn't belong, something sewn into the lining of the shoulder seam. Her hand stilled. She didn't need to see what it was. She already knew. Unit patches. The kind soldiers carried when they'd done work so classified that even the uniform they wore couldn't acknowledge it. She'd sewn one into her own jacket the same way. Surgical precision. The same kind of work. The same kind of hands. "You're safe here," she said, and meant it with the force of a command. "I'm going to take care of you." And in that moment, Natalie Hayes understood that the careful life she'd constructed, the invisibility, the scrubs, the 8-hour shifts that stretched into eternity, had just collapsed like the compound in Marjah. The boy she'd saved had come back to find her. And she had no idea that Dr. Sterling had already noticed her hovering over this particular patient, already making calculations about risk and threat and the precise value of a nurse who seemed to care too much about a homeless veteran with no insurance and no family. Friday morning at Mercy General ER, Dr. Sterling gathered for residents in the cafeteria with the calculated ease of a man who'd never faced consequence. He leaned against the counter, coffee in hand, voice pitched loud enough to carry. $20 as the jumpy one quits by next Friday. He gestured toward the hallway where Natalie moved past the windows, lunch tray balanced in her hands. She flinches when someone drops a pen. Can't handle pressure. The residents laughed, the hollow laugh of people afraid to disagree with power. Sterling smiled like a predator showing its teeth. He had already called the nursing school listed on her resume. He had already started the paperwork. This was just theater. Natalie didn't hear him. She moved through the cafeteria the way she'd moved through Marjah, present but invisible, making herself smaller than her actual size, reading exits and angles and the precise distance to safety. Her lunch tray held a turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. Normal things. Things that mattered to normal people. Sterling watched her approach. Then he stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me, sweetheart." She stopped. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like everything about him. His shoulder moved in a casual arc. It wasn't casual. It was calculated. The tray tilted. Coffee sloshed. The sandwich slid. Then gravity finished what he started. The tray hit the tile with the flat crack of impact. Jello splattered across the floor in arterial patterns. The apple rolled under a table. Silence spread through the cafeteria like spilled water. 20 faces turned. Residents stared. A dietary tech froze mid-step. Sterling's smile widened. "Oops. Clean that up." His voice carried the edge of a man testing something, pushing against a boundary to see where it would break. Natalie looked at the mess. She looked at Sterling. For one breath, the world compressed into a single point, his face, her choice, the gallery of witnesses. She took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape. Wiped it away without breaking eye contact. The tear surprised him. He expected anger or frustration or the breaking point he'd been hunting for. What he got was something else entirely. Something that made the residents lean back. Something that made the fluorescent lights seem to buzz louder in the sudden quiet. "I've knelt in blood and sand for men better than you." Her voice was bedrock. Steady. Precise. "A little disrespect won't break me." Sterling's smile froze. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of refrigeration units and the distant beep of a monitor from somewhere deeper in the hospital. He recovered first, because men like Sterling always do. They're faster at pretending control than actually maintaining it. "We'll see," he said, and walked away. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment where everything changed direction. That afternoon, Sterling began the systematic dismantling of her schedule. He assigned her to every weekend shift, 12 hours straight with no relief, a violation of union policy but buried deep enough in override protocols that nobody would challenge him. Not yet. He logged her into the trauma codes, the high-acuity cases that required split-second decisions and dealt with the broken people that nobody else wanted to handle. Testing her. Documenting every pause, every moment of hesitation. By Wednesday, the nursing school from her fabricated resume had confirmed what he already suspected: the credentials didn't exist. The woman called herself Natalie Hayes, but the woman who'd graduated from that program 6 years ago was someone else entirely. He started a file. Performance concerns. Questionable judgment. Scope of practice violations. Each entry was a nail in a coffin that wouldn't close for 6 more days. He made copies. Called 3 board members, men who owed him for malpractice incidents he'd helped bury, for billing codes he'd taught them to obscure, for the kind of silence that only came from shared complicity. "We have a problem in nursing," he told them. "Credentials issues. Possibly fraudulent documentation." The board members nodded. They understood what he wasn't saying. Thursday morning, Sterling passed Natalie in the hallway outside ICU. He was moving fast, carrying charts and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your opponent has no moves left. "How's the pressure, sweetheart?" "Still hanging on." She said nothing. Kept walking. He noticed her hands trembling as she reached for a medication cabinet. He made a note. Poor motor control. Stress response. Unsuitable for acute care environment. The documentation was beautiful, all facts, all evidence, all the careful architecture of a termination that would survive legal review. That evening, at 6 o'clock, a blind veteran arrived at Mercy General's ER on a gurney. The intake nurse logged him quickly, non-critical abdominal pain, referred to waiting area, VA insurance code flagged for reduced reimbursement. Dr. Sterling glanced at the chart, saw the code, assigned him to the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2. Not a bed. Not a monitored space. The hallway. A place where time moved differently, where hours dissolved into each other without intervention or care. Hour 2, the veteran asked for water. A junior resident told him to wait his turn. Hour 5, he mentioned chest pressure. An aide noted it on the chart but didn't escalate. Nobody escalates for a homeless translator with no family and a VA card that paid less than his bed space cost. Hour 8, Natalie was walking back from her break, passing the hallway, moving between the chaos of the ER and the smaller chaos of her own thoughts. She saw him, an older man, dark-skinned, wearing a jacket despite the summer heat, his milky white eyes unfocused, his breathing shallow and wrong. She stopped. Something in her nervous system recognized something in him. Not consciously. Deeper than that. She knelt beside the stretcher. "Sir, I'm going to check your vitals." His hand found hers. His accent was thick, Pashto-inflected, the way certain sounds cling to a person even after 2 decades in America. "Thank you, sister." Her hands froze on his wrist. That voice, older, deeper, weathered by years and loss and the specific gravity of survival, carried a cadence she'd heard only once before. A 7-year-old boy, buried under concrete and rebar in Marjah, his voice small and steady as she dug him out with her hands that had held lives together in the dark. She'd carried him 3 miles through mortar fire to the medical station. She'd never known if he'd made it. Never knew his name, never looked at the records, just let him go into the machinery of military medicine and disappeared back into operations before she could ask. She forced her hand steady. Took his pulse. Thready. Rapid. His neck veins were distended, the way they bulge when pressure backs up against the heart. She placed her stethoscope against his chest. Heart sounds muffled. Distant. Like they were coming through water. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, the sac around the heart, was filling with fluid, compressing the ventricles, choking the organ that kept him alive. Without intervention, he had hours. Maybe less. She stood. Found Dr. Sterling writing notes in the main ER. That veteran in the hallway needs immediate intervention. Her voice was calm. Professional. I'm hearing muffled heart sounds and his JVD is elevated. Possible cardiac tamponade. Sterling didn't look up from his chart. I'll decide what's immediate. Get back to your assigned patients. He walked away. Just walked away. Natalie stood for one breath, then returned to the hallway. Hour 9, she checked him again. His skin had turned cold, a grey-white color, his lips taking on a faint blue tint. Cyanotic. The body shutting down. She pulled his chart, scrolled through the intake information, saw his name listed as Khalid Amir, saw his history documented in terse military language, translator, embedded with special forces, IED exposure, bilateral orbital trauma, vision loss total and permanent. She saw the year he'd been injured, 2004. The year she'd pulled a child from rubble in Marjah. The same year. Her breath caught. The room tilted slightly. Then she pulled herself back. Hour 10, his lips turned a deeper blue. His breathing had become labored, each inhalation a visible effort. The oxygen saturation monitor on the EKG showed 68 and dropping. 55. His heart rate was climbing, the final desperate attempt of an organ trying to pump against resistance. The hiss of his ragged breathing filled the small space around the stretcher. This was when most people would have called for backup, would have escalated the chain of command, would have followed protocol and let the system decide. But Natalie wasn't most people. Natalie had spent 20 years in an occupation where following protocol got people killed. She moved toward the medication cabinet, her hand steady now, muscle memory from 100 field operations overriding everything else. She knew exactly what she needed. Knew exactly how to do it. She just didn't know yet that Dr. Sterling was watching from the shadows of the monitor station, already preparing the call he'd make to hospital security. The hallway was emptying. It was 10:13 p.m. when Natalie's eyes caught the monitor outside Bay 4 of the blind veteran's room. She'd been watching from the medication station, pretending to restock while Dr. Sterling worked 3 bays down, deliberately reassigning the code team to a patient with stable vitals in room 2. The transfer request had come through at 10:15. Just like that. Just like he'd planned it. BP 68 40 seconds. Heart rate 138. Respirations 27. She moved closer to the monitor. The numbers were collapsing like a building under controlled demolition. She knew those numbers. Knew exactly what they meant. Natalie pulled up the veteran's chart on her phone. The chart Sterling had locked her out of at 8:16 p.m. with a notation that read, RN Hayes to maintain distance per scope of practice protocol. Dr. Sterling overseeing care exclusively. She'd read those words 3 times. Counted the lies in them twice. The veteran had been waiting in that hallway since 10 a.m. 30 minutes ago, he'd stopped asking for water. She could hear him from the supply room. Not asking. Not calling out. Just breathing. The sound of a man in distress who'd learned long ago that asking didn't help. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Natalie stood in front of the supply cabinet, her hands steady on the metal handles. Around her, the ER hummed with the normal rhythm of 11 p.m., stretcher wheels squeaking, monitors beeping their algorithms of human suffering, residents laughing about something in the break room that wasn't funny because nothing was funny when you ignored people in hallways. She grabbed a catheter kit. A 16-gauge needle. Sterile gloves. Everything fit in the pocket of her scrubs because she'd trained in field conditions where you carried your entire operating room on your body. The veteran's blind eyes tracked her movement the moment she entered the bay. He couldn't see her, but he heard the change in air pressure, the same way a person can sense a door opening behind them in darkness. Some senses compensate. Others transcend. Sister. His voice was thin. Fractured. The voice of a man whose oxygen saturation was dropping with every word. She didn't answer with words. Words were for people who still had time for them. She positioned him supine, moved his hospital gown aside, exposed the subxiphoid area below his ribcage. His skin was cool. Clammy. The skin of someone whose heart couldn't pump blood forward anymore because fluid had surrounded it like a fist closing. I need you very still, she said. Her voice had dropped to what the Navy called command frequency, not loud, not aggressive, just the tone that made people's nervous systems understand they were in the presence of someone who'd made decisions in worse conditions than this. I trust you, sister. His hand found her wrist. She could feel his pulse there, racing like a bird trying to escape a cage. Always did. The needle was cool in her palm. She'd held this same needle in 100 places, Marjah, Kandahar, FOB Shank, and the physics of it never changed. Anatomy was geography, and she'd memorized every border. 30-degree angle. Advance toward the left shoulder. Feel for the pop. The moment the needle pierces the pericardial sac, you know it because the resistance changes. Because the body speaks a language older than words. The pop came at 2 centimeters of depth. She withdrew the plunger. Blood-tinged fluid filled the syringe. 50 milliliters. His breathing eased. 100 milliliters. His BP climbed from 68/40 seconds to 90/50ths. 200 milliliters and his eyes, unseeing but somehow aware, relaxed into something that wasn't quite peace but was close enough to look like it. Pressure's coming back, she said. Not to him. To herself. To the thousands of training hours stored in her muscles and her bone memory. To the part of her that had learned to operate in conditions where failure meant body bags and flag presentations to families who already knew they wouldn't get their loved ones home. That's when Dr. Sterling's voice came through the doorway like breaking glass. What the hell are you doing? He shoved past the curtain, his white coat swinging like a weapon. His eyes went to the catheter, to the syringe now sitting on the bedside table, to Natalie's hand still positioned over the patient's chest. His face went the color of old brick. "You just performed a procedure you have no authority for." His voice was climbing, losing its professional register, becoming the voice of a man watching his control slip away. "You've exceeded your scope of practice. You're a registered nurse, not a cardiologist. Not even a PA." She straightened. Didn't answer. The veteran's color was returning. His breathing had deepened. His BP had stabilized at 98/58. Those were the only numbers that mattered, and they all said alive. Sterling's hand was already moving. "Phone out." Dialing before he even finished his sentence. "Security. Bay 4. Now." She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't explain. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst doesn't argue with men who are just now discovering they're losing. "This is a violation of hospital protocol," Sterling continued, his voice becoming structured again, more dangerous for it. "More than that, this is a violation of state medical law. You've put yourself in a position where..." He stopped. Smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just realized he had weapons and didn't need to keep talking. "Actually, this is perfect." 2 security guards appeared. They didn't run. That's how Natalie knew Sterling had been planning this. They'd been standing in the hallway, waiting for him to use them. "Badge and ID." Sterling pointed at her the way a general points at a map. "She's terminated for reckless endangerment. Escort her from the building." The veteran's hand shot out, reaching blindly toward where Natalie had been standing. "No. No, she saved my..." Sterling's voice cut him off with surgical precision. "Sir, you're in shock. You don't know what happened. You're confused from the medication. We'll get you stabilized now that you're under proper care." The words were lies shaped like competence. That was Sterling's real skill, not the corruption, not the billing fraud, not the offshore accounts. It was his ability to make cruelty sound like medicine. To make firing the person who'd just saved a life sound like protocol. Natalie's badge was heavy in her hand when the senior security guard took it. She'd worn it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of learning to disappear in a place where people were dying and nobody was watching. 6 weeks of watching Sterling rewrite records and bill phantom procedures and understand that nobody was going to stop him because nobody was looking. Now everyone was looking. Just not at him. The hospital investigator, a man named Caldwell with the effect of a document processing machine, was already waiting in the hallway, notepad in hand. She heard him before she saw him, because his footsteps had the rhythm of someone who'd already written the ending. "Miss Hayes? I'm going to need a full statement about what just occurred in Bay 4. She didn't answer. Didn't slow down. The automatic doors slid open to the Savannah night, and the rain hit her face like a baptism of something she hadn't asked for. Water and humidity and the smell of the hospital's ventilation system mixing with the Atlantic 50 miles away, salt and diesel exhaust and the green smell of standing water. She walked to her car without looking back. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The same restraint that had kept her alive in Marjah when she could have screamed, could have lost it, could have let the weight of other people's children crush her into the sand. At 11:34 p.m., Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes sat in her car in the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, and understood that she'd just saved the wrong person's life. The rain hammered the windshield like applause from an audience that would never know her name. Dr. Sterling sat in his private office on the 3rd floor of Mercy General, mahogany desk gleaming under recessed lighting, phone already in hand before the cleaning crew finished mopping the trauma bays. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who'd made this particular call 100 times before. Board member number 1, Richard Bancroft, Chief of Surgery, answered on the second ring. They'd worked together for 17 years, ever since Sterling had buried a malpractice complaint involving Bancroft's son, a resident caught prescribing controlled substances to friends. "Richard." We have a problem. Sterling's voice was smooth as aged scotch. A nurse performed a procedure outside her scope. Cardiac tamponade case. She did an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician oversight. Bancroft's silence carried weight. That's significant. It is. But here's what concerns me more: she's been accessing billing records, making accusations about my coding practices. I need this contained. 3 minutes later, Sterling hung up and dialed board member number 2, Patricia Gould, the hospital's chief financial officer, who'd been looking the other way on his inflated VA billing for 8 years in exchange for quarterly bonuses that touched her offshore account. Patricia, we need an emergency credentialing committee meeting. Tonight. He didn't wait for a response. By 9:41 p.m., Sterling had activated a network that stretched like a spiderweb through 3 county systems. Former residents who now held power. Hospital administrators with their own secrets. Attorneys who specialized in burying uncomfortable documentation. The phone calls compounded like interest. Each conversation a favor called in, each favor a pressure point applied. But that wasn't the worst part. At 10:15 p.m., Sterling made a call to Dean Margaret Foster at the University of Georgia School of Nursing, the institution Natalie had listed on her employment application. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd trained half the cardiologists in the state. Margaret, I'm calling regarding one of your recent graduates. Natalie Hayes. There's been a serious incident at our facility involving scope of practice violations. We're launching a formal investigation. I wanted to give your institution a courtesy heads-up before we file charges. He didn't mention that her transcript showed no graduation from UGA. He didn't mention that the application credentials were incomplete. He simply planted the seed and waited for it to grow. The dean's silence told him everything. I see. Well, we'll need to verify her academic standing immediately. By 10:36 p.m., Sterling had also summoned Dr. Helena Reeves, the hospital's patient safety officer, to his office. She arrived with her clipboard, her nervous smile, her complete deference to his rank. He didn't need to pressure her. The job itself was pressure enough. He simply laid out the narrative he'd constructed: unauthorized procedure, clear endangerment, pattern of boundary violations, and, most importantly, the billing discrepancy allegations as evidence of a disturbed employee lashing out with false accusations after facing consequences. Dr. Sterling, I'll need to document this conversation. And we'll need to involve HR. Absolutely. I'm glad you take this seriously. The hospital's liability exposure here is substantial. 3 words: liability exposure. The real language of institutional fear. By 11:24 p.m., Sterling had created a paper trail. Emails to the credentialing committee marked urgent. A formal report to the hospital's risk management office. A summary of the evening's investigation that made him sound like a thorough professional protecting patient safety rather than a man covering his financial crimes. The building was nearly empty when the security guards arrived at the ER with an envelope and an assignment. Sterling had anticipated everything. Natalie's badge confiscated. Her locker sealed. An escort out of the building that would humiliate her in front of whatever staff remained on the night shift. By 11:15 p.m., 2 security officers stood at the ER nurses' station, asking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes by the name she'd lived under: just Natalie, just a nurse, just someone who didn't matter enough to protect. She came out of trauma bay too, still wearing scrubs with the veteran's blood drying under her fingernails. The security officers didn't make eye contact. They simply stated the facts with the rhythm of a recitation: you're being escorted from the premises. Your badge is confiscated effective immediately. Hospital legal will be in contact regarding the incident from this evening. Natalie didn't ask questions. She'd heard this rhythm before, not in hospitals, but in other institutional settings where power was absolute and explanation was optional. She walked with them to her locker, watched as they photographed the contents before she was permitted to empty it. Her jacket. Her phone. A photograph of her late husband in his marine dress blues, taken the week before he understood what Marjah had done to her and never asked her to explain it again. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects. Her fellow nurses watched from a distance. Nobody spoke. The silence was so thick you could feel the pressure change. One of them, a night shift nurse named Sarah who'd worked beside her for 4 weeks, stepped forward. "Wait, this doesn't make sense. She saved that man's life." Dr. Sterling was nowhere near. "This matter is under investigation," the security officer said flatly. "We're just doing our job." Natalie met Sarah's eyes for exactly 1 second. The message was clear: don't fight this. Don't make it worse. She'd learned this lesson in Marjah, learned it in the years after when every loud noise triggered a panic response and she couldn't explain to anyone why she sometimes flinched at the sound of a door slamming. Sometimes survival meant accepting the unfair outcome and walking forward anyway. They escorted her past the patient rooms, past the monitoring stations, past the code crash cart where she'd trained for 12 weeks to be competent with equipment she'd already known how to use from a lifetime of field operations. At the ER exit, the security officer handed her a sealed envelope. "Hospital counsel requires you to receive this. Do not open it until you're off the premises." She took it without reading the return address. She already knew what it said. The rain had intensified. Savannah in October, humidity thick as a living thing, storm clouds that moved like they owned the sky. Natalie didn't go home. She couldn't face the apartment on Victory Drive, couldn't sit in the silence of a space she'd chosen specifically because it lacked the character that might remind her of anything. Instead, she drove east toward the river, toward the place she'd visited exactly once since moving to Georgia 2 years ago. Riverside Cemetery opened its gates at all hours for those who needed to stand in the rain and remember why they'd stopped fighting. The grave was marked with a simple stone. Captain Marcus James Hayes, United States Marine Corps, 1978 to 2017. Beloved husband. The dates told the whole story in miniature. The line underneath was Natalie's choice, he understood. She stood in the rain without an umbrella, mud soaking through her shoes, one hand pressed against the granite as if she could reach through stone to where he'd been buried with full military honors while she stood in dress blues and didn't cry. The rain hammered down. Her hands were steady. She'd learned that particular skill in Marjah when crying might give away your position to someone who wanted you dead. "I found him," she whispered. "The boy from Marjah." Khalid. Her voice didn't shake. "He grew up. He became a translator. He lost his sight to an IED helping American forces." She looked down at her hands, the hands that had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with a catheter kit and memory, hands that had carried a 7-year-old child through mortar fire, hands that had held her husband while he slipped away from meningitis and military medicine that couldn't reach him in time. "And I still couldn't protect him without losing everything." The rain intensified. Lightning cracked overhead like distant artillery, and she didn't flinch. That was the problem, she realized. She'd trained herself so thoroughly not to flinch that now she couldn't feel anything at all. "I walked away from the uniform because I couldn't take one more explosion. One more body." Her voice was steady as a metronome. "I chose anonymity. I chose healing others. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I just helped people, if I just disappeared, then maybe the damage from Marjah would stop spreading." She pressed both hands against the gravestone. But it wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, missed calls from Mercy General's legal department, from Sterling's assistant, from the state nursing board. 3 calls in the last 4 minutes. She pulled it out and powered it down without reading the messages. The device went dark like a light switch turned off at an institutional level. She stood alone in the rain at her husband's grave in Savannah, Georgia, and understood the particular mathematics of sacrifice. Everything she'd given had never been enough, and everything she'd lost was final. The wind howled through the cemetery like it was carrying messages between worlds, and she finally understood why her husband had smiled when she told him she was leaving the service. He'd known something she was only beginning to learn, that the wars you survive are always the ones that follow you home. The morning came cold and wet, rain hammering the parking lot like someone was demanding answers from the sky. Natalie didn't go home. She sat in her car outside Mercy General until the sun rose, watching the shifts change, watching people walk in who still had badges clipped to their scrubs. She didn't cry. The time for tears had passed somewhere between her husband's grave and the moment security told her to never come back. What she didn't know was that her chart discrepancies, the one she'd documented in her first week, the one she'd submitted anonymously through a federal hotline she'd found while sitting in a break room at 3 in the morning, had already reached the FBI's healthcare fraud division. The tip had included dates, patient names, procedure codes, invoice numbers. Everything Sterling had tried to hide behind inflated complexity and veteran-patient confusion. It wasn't a request for justice. It was evidence. Evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes didn't just spot corruption. She'd catalogued it. 72 hours. That's all it took for federal forensic accountants to trace the pattern backward and forward through 8 years of Sterling's billing records. $847,000. Not in the hospital's accounts. In offshore accounts registered to shell companies with Sterling's name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork, accounts that existed specifically because he'd learned that complexity was camouflage. Phantom surgeries. Equipment costs for procedures never performed. Cardiac catheterizations billed to patients who'd never seen the inside of an operating room. He'd targeted veteran patients deliberately, their complex VA paperwork, their medical histories fragmented across multiple hospitals, their tendency not to question authority after years of following orders. Predatory mathematics. That's what the federal prosecutor would call it in trial transcripts later. The board members Sterling had called that night, the ones who owed him for buried malpractice incidents, for covered-up infections, for cases they'd all agreed to forget, they crumbled under FBI questioning like buildings in controlled demolition. One of them wept. Another lawyered up immediately. The third agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, his voice shaking as he described Sterling's casual conversations about creative billing and maximizing revenue streams from high-complexity cases. The nursing school Natalie had listed on her fabricated resume confirmed their credentials. Then they revealed something the FBI had asked them to keep quiet for 3 months. Sterling had called personally, demanding they verify her hire date, her qualifications, her references. The FBI had asked the school to play along, to act as if her resume was legitimate. They'd been building the case all along. Hospital security footage showed Sterling's deliberate actions in HD clarity. Him redirecting the code team when Natalie went to check on the blind veteran. Him removing the patient's monitor from the central station. Him standing in the hallway, watching color deteriorate for 10 hours, never once ordering a single test. The prosecution would use this footage in trial. It would be shown on the news. People would watch Sterling's face as he ignored a suffering man and understand exactly what kind of person he was. His lawyer tried to negotiate. The U.S. attorney refused. Too many cameras, too much publicity, too many federal agents already invested in a case that had become about more than stolen money. It had become about institutional accountability, about what happens when the system trusts the wrong people. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Natalie testified in dress uniform, standing in the witness box with the kind of stillness that made jurors believe every word she spoke. She described the billing discrepancies she'd noticed her first week. The patterns that didn't match clinical reality. How she documented everything meticulously because documentation was survival, because her old life had taught her that records were protection. She described submitting the anonymous tip before Sterling ever knocked her tray to the floor. I knew what he was doing, she told the prosecutor. I just needed proof. Cross-examination tried to crack her composure, to suggest she was a vengeful employee with a fabricated military background and false credentials. The defense attorney leaned forward, voice sharp as a blade. Isn't it true you falsified your resume? Natalie took one measured breath. Her voice didn't waver. I chose anonymity to heal from PTSD. I never falsified my competence. She paused. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the rain outside hitting the courthouse windows. I saved his life with knowledge and training I earned in 20 years of service to this country. That part was real. Khalid testified after her, his hand guided gently to the witness stand by a court officer. He described the 10 hours in the hallway. How the pain in his chest had become a wall he couldn't see through. How he'd heard her voice and recognized it from somewhere in the deepest part of his memory, a voice that had spoken to him in Pashto in the rubble of his childhood home, telling him he would be okay. She carried me 3 miles under fire when I was 7 years old, he said, his voice steady. Today, she carried me again. That nurse is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes. The SEAL team leader testified about her service record. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. The prosecution showed her official military photo. The courtroom understood then what the defense had been trying to hide. They weren't fighting a disgruntled nurse. They were fighting institutional failure. The jury deliberated for hours. Guilty on all counts. Healthcare fraud. Conspiracy. Money laundering. The sentence came down like a gavel striking through his entire life: 5 years federal prison, $2.3 million in restitution to victims, permanent revocation of medical license, and something the judge added that wasn't technically part of the sentence but hit harder than anything written in the legal code. She told him he would never work in healthcare again, in any capacity, anywhere in the United States. But before the prison doors opened, there was the waiting period. The public humiliation. Sterling taught CPR at Savannah Community College for minimum wage, his hands shaking as he demonstrated chest compressions on plastic mannequins to bored teenagers who had no idea they were learning from a disgraced cardiologist. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. News cycles ran his mugshot alongside headlines about corruption and predation. His name became synonymous with everything wrong with institutional medicine, with choosing profit over patients, power over people, greed over the oath he'd taken decades ago. The camera crews followed him leaving the courthouse. The prosecutors spoke about justice served. The news anchor summarized his downfall with the kind of finality that erases a person from the landscape of respectability. 6 months after sentencing, Natalie stood in dress uniform at the Armody Veteran Center dedication ceremony, a new VA hospital wing in Savannah funded entirely by recovered fraud money, Sterling's money, redistributed to the people he'd victimized. The building was modern, built with federal standards for trauma-informed care, staffed with people who understood that healing required both clinical precision and human compassion. Khalid stood beside her in a suit, his hand resting on her shoulder with the kind of weight that meant everything. The faded unit patch that had been sewn inside his jacket lining for 2 decades was now framed on the wall behind them, mounted beside a photo of the original 160th SAW team that had pulled him out of Marjah. Natalie had accepted reinstatement to active duty as a training consultant, teaching combat medics about PTSD recognition, about how to heal from invisible wounds, about the long road back to trusting yourself again. Her hands still shook sometimes when the weather changed, when a door slammed without warning, when she walked past a trauma bay and heard the particular rhythm of a flatlining monitor. But she no longer hid it. She talked about it. That was new. The crowd included her old SEAL team, the FBI agents who'd built the case, 60 veterans Sterling had defrauded who'd each received restitution checks and letters of apology signed by a woman who'd never met them but understood their violation intimately. Mercy General's new chief of staff offered her a civilian nursing position that she politely declined. She'd learned something about herself in the fire, that she needed the structure of service, the clarity of command, the knowing that she was part of something larger than any single institution. Khalid approached the microphone first, his guide leading him to the edge of the platform where the ribbon hung. He turned toward where Natalie stood. 20 years ago, a warrior became my angel. Yesterday, an angel became my warrior again. Today, we honor both. His voice carried through the speaker system like it was carrying weight between worlds. He reached for the ribbon. Natalie guided his hands to the cutting edge of the scissors. Flash of cameras. Sound of applause already beginning. Natalie stepped forward then, taking the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces. She saw the SEAL team leader near the back, his eyes wet. She saw the FBI agent who'd believed her when she said she'd submitted that anonymous tip. She saw Sterling's face on the news crawl at the base of the camera crane, sentenced, disgraced, forgotten, teaching CPR to people who would never know they were being trained by a man who'd chosen money over lives. I tried to disappear because I thought I was broken, she said, her voice steady as bedrock. What I learned is that healing isn't hiding. And service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Some of us wear our service in ways the world doesn't see, in shift work, in staying late to check on patients, in refusing to look away when something's wrong. She paused. Looked at Khalid. Looked at the veterans. Looked at the hospital building that would serve thousands of people who needed help finding their way back. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. The applause lasted 3 minutes. People stood. Veterans came forward afterward with shaking hands and tears, thanking her, telling her stories about what restitution had meant for their families, how the money had helped, how knowing someone cared enough to fight had mattered more. Khalid never left her side, his hand on her arm, grounding her in the present moment instead of letting memory pull her backward. That evening, after the cameras left and the crowd dispersed, Natalie visited her husband's grave. She placed her Navy Cross beside his Purple Heart, framed in matching glass, evidence that the wars they'd fought together hadn't ended with his service, that his death had forced her to survive in new ways. "I'm okay now," she whispered to the rain. "I found my way back." The words didn't feel like a lie anymore. They felt like a beginning. Across town, Sterling taught CPR in a fluorescent-lit classroom, his medical career reduced to demonstrating chest compressions to teenagers who were thinking about weekend plans, his legacy shrinking with every day, his name already fading from institutional memory, replaced by stories about integrity and courage, the opposite of everything he'd chosen to be. If you've ever felt invisible in a system that didn't value you, if you've ever spotted something wrong and wondered if speaking up was worth the cost, Natalie's story is for you. Please hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling us your own story of choosing integrity over survival, and share this video with someone who needs to know that heroes really do walk among us.